Welcome back to Pit Perspective. I'm your host, Roger Sherman, pitmaster and owner of the District Pit Barbecue Catering Company in Washington, D.C., coming to you from the O Street Mansion. My guest today is Briana Thomas, author of Black Broadway in Washington, D.C., a narration of U Street's rich history from the early triumphs of emancipation to the days of civil rights through the recent struggles of gentrification. Briana has been published in Washingtonian Magazine, the historic Afro-American newspaper, and the Washington Post throughout her journalism career. And for some reason, she's here at the mansion talking to me today. So Briana, thanks for coming to the show.
Thanks for having me.
You wrote a book on Black Broadway, U Street in Washington, D.C. I'm a Washington, D.C. native. Everybody knows it. I talk about it all the time. I'm very proud of it. Outside of Washington, D.C., everybody knows about Georgetown. Most people will have some familiarity with DuPont. But outside of Washington, D.C., U Street might not be as famous as some of the other neighborhoods, but it's a gem within the District of Columbia. You recently wrote a book on it. I'm going to get out of your way. Tell me about the premise of your book.
Yeah, so my book is, the core of it is the Black Broadway Era. And so this is the golden era of U Street, and it's from the 1900s, early 1900s to about the mid 1900s. And during that time, there were more than 300 Black-owned businesses, about 100 Black churches. There were several jazz spots and after-hour spots and clubs and theaters. And it was really a place where Black people could come to have fun, where they can be entertained, where they could be educated, and they could also be activists. And so that became known as Black Broadway.
See, that is spectacular. So again, I've been growing up in my whole life spending time in the U Street corridor. There's great restaurants there that I'm familiar with. The most famous would probably be Ben's Chili Bowl. The historic Lincoln Theater is on U Street. So with all that in mind, you mentioned it's from the early 1900s to the mid 1900s where there were 300 Black businesses, and it's significantly less now. There were 100 Black churches, it's significantly less now. What prompted you to want to write this history, and what was your inspiration to do so?
Yeah, so my prompting to write this history is, as you mentioned and reading my bio, is that I wrote for Washingtonian Magazine. And so back in 2016, I was working there as an editorial fellow, just a little kid, and I got assigned this project, right, to look into the history of U Street. And actually, it was a photo story essay. And so what I did was I went to different libraries and museums and things like that, and I gathered photos from this Black Broadway era specifically, and then I took it to the community and interviewed different business owners, Ben's Chili Bowl owner, Miss Virginia Ali being one of them, and I got their stories of what it was like to be on U Street during its heyday, what it was like to be on U Street during the time where everybody knew everybody, right? Where everyone was dressed up and everybody was supporting one another, and Black money was supporting Black businesses. And the stories we're capturing, they really fueled my passion for this history that I had originally heard from my grandmother myself, because my grandmother, she moved from Suffolk, Virginia to Washington, D.C. In the 40s and 50s, which was not uncommon for women back during that time. There were way more opportunities here in D.C. for Black people, once again, than it were in other parts of the nation. And so she worked for the federal government, but she'd come to U Street all the time to go out, to go to restaurants, to eat and things like that. And when I was growing up, she took me sightseeing on U Street, took me to Howard Theater, took me to Ben's Chili Bowls, all these different places. And that really is what inspired me to really dive into the project and not just be a news article, but something that I can grow into more. And now we have a book.
There you are. So, people familiar with Washington, D.C. might know this as Chocolate City. So when I was a kid growing up here, you know, the population of the District of Columbia was 70 to 75% African American. It's much less than that now. It's probably around 50%. So we had 300 businesses on U Street. What are we at now?
We are at 3 businesses, Black businesses, specifically from the Black Broadway era. There are only 3 remaining. That is Ben's Chili Bowl, which was opened, I believe, 1958. And then you have Lee's Flower and Car Shop, which was opened in 1945. And then you have Industrial Savings Bank, which was the first Black bank in DC. Those are the 3 remaining from the Black Broadway era. So you have 300 down to 3.
So 300 down to 3. Simple question, what happened?
So the simple question is a more complicated answer, right? And I talk about this in my book. A lot of different people, researchers, historians, community members, entrepreneurs, they kind of attribute the decline of Black Broadway to so many different factors, and one being the first desegregation. So segregation is really what pushed Black people to U Street, because in other parts of town there were Jim Crow laws. You couldn't even go to a department store downtown as a Black woman and try on a hat, right? Which is disturbing. But on U Street you could. You were free to not just have your own, but you were free to patronize wherever you wanted to and spend your money and raise your children without the fear of being persecuted really for the color of your skin. Well, that was one thing that pushed Black people to U Street. You had Howard University there. You had M Street High School, which was the first high school in the nation to admit Black students. And so these different places brought Black people to the area because they could not go elsewhere, not just in the nation, but literally in DC. Well, when Brown versus Board of Education, you know that's the start of the civil rights movement. In 1954, schools are desegregated. And I actually have a excerpt in my book of Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, who wrote the foreword to my book, detailing how she remembers being in class and hearing that announced over the loudspeaker that schools had been desegregated. And so eventually we had things like the Civil Rights Act and all these other things that killed Jim Crow, which is great. However, that's not that good for businesses, and it's not as good for these schools who at one point we had Black people supporting Black people, and now that things are desegregated, you can go elsewhere.
Anywhere. Yes.
Well, the next factor in that are the 1968 riots, when Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated, right? You have these major riots on U Street. People are upset. They're furious, as they should have been, and as we still are, right? I mean, just because things aren't burning doesn't mean that we aren't burning on the inside. We've seen that all throughout last year up until now, and that was another factor because U Street was literally destroyed. A lot of businesses were burned down. It turned into rubble. It was not a safe place, and that really ushers us into the Chocolate City era, where you mentioned the population of DC at that time, but the 1970 census tells us that the population for DC specifically was 70% Black. That's a huge difference in number, right, for what we see now. But just because there were a lot of Black people on U Street doesn't mean that it was also a safe place. You have the crack epidemic, so that's another factor in the decline of the golden years of U Street. And then the last factor would be the metro construction. So metro, we get these plans towards the late 70s, and we're going to build a subway, right? And that's exciting. But the subway, not only does it close businesses for several years while this construction is happening, Ben's Chili Bowl, Lee's Flower and Car Shop, they literally have photos of how it looked when you came. You couldn't even drive up U Street during that time. That's another factor. I mean, imagine being a business owner and you can't be open. So those are
Sounds familiar.
right.
Maybe some of us have experienced that in the last year.
Yeah. So we can imagine that now because we just went through it. So those were the factors that really played in the decline in the change of the glory days of U Street, and we see what we see now, which is gentrification.
So what's the most inspirational story that you gain from your conversations with the businesses on U Street and the historians associated with U Street? Give me one really inspirational story that you can point to and say that this is what Washington, D.C. is, this is what U Street is.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many inspirational stories, honestly, but I would say one that's inspiring, especially just talking about business owners and things like that, something that I feel like is Virginia Ali and how she came to DC. She moved to DC from Tappahannock, Virginia at 21. She lived with her sister off of 14th Street, and she got a job working at the first Black bank in DC, Industrial Savings, and she was there as a bank teller. Now, to you, you're like, that's not that exciting. But you're thinking about the time period and where most women at that time, they were, live-in servants. They literally were cleaning homes and watching other people's children all day long. But she came from the South, moved to DC, and was able to get a job at a bank. Now, while she's at that bank, she's seeing different business people come in, Black business people with bags of cash, right? She's having the experience of being a teller. So you're around money and you're seeing how money works and you're seeing how money flows. And a few years later, after she marries Ben, they decide to go a few blocks down from Industrial Savings Bank, and they become entrepreneurs and business owners themselves. And to me, that's inspiring because you think of Ben's Chili Bowl and how the Ali family really is a great family, but how they've been around for years. Right. But she started working a normal job. So you can start from anywhere. And for me, that's just inspiring. And you can be anyone and do it.
So what was the most disturbing thing that you found? Something that really brought you down? I mean, obviously, the the big disturbing part of this is, like, you've got 300 businesses, you're down to 3. That is 1%. So as that continues to, as you did your research and you saw those numbers drop, what was the most disturbing thing, or what was the saddest portion of your research that you can point to?
Yeah, I say the saddest and the hardest chapter for me to write was chapter 1, right? Because I had to go through slavery.
Yes.
To even talk about how U Street is formed. And the nation's capital, and unfortunately we saw this on January 6th with the insurrection and things like that, but we are supposed to be the staple for liberty and freedom, and DC was a major slave market and a major trading post. A
lot of people forget that Washington, D.C. is in the South. That doesn't always register with everybody. Yes, the capital of the United States, Washington, D.C., the Confederate capital was only 90 miles down the road in Richmond, and a lot of people don't really make that connection. So when you say slavery in Washington, D.C., there were slave quarters on the White House grounds. That is a thing. That actually happened.
Yeah, and slaves also contributed to rebuilding the city, right? After we had certain buildings and things burnt down with the British, and that's a separate thing. But nonetheless, that was the most disturbing and hardest thing because it's our history. And my book is titled Black Broadway, Washington, D.C., but we started there. Right? We started as slaves. We started as being beat, and not just prejudice, but you're literally, I have a photo in my book that shows what you just mentioned, but slave coffles, people tied up to one another in chains, yes, walking in front of the Capitol. And so that was disturbing. That was upsetting. And I think when you're talking about journaling the history, it's so important to tell the full history of anything. And although I wanted to bring the flashiness of Black Broadway, you have to start with the truth. And the truth is that's a part of our history. And I think in parallel to that, the next disturbing thing is gentrification, right? Where we are now, how my book ends of, yes, there's triumph, and we have, there are a lot of different things we're seeing to fight gentrification. Don't Mute DC being one of them. But the next disturbing thing was sitting down with business owners like Wanda Henderson in my book, who has a salon off of Georgia Avenue, who went through a year after year battle with real estate developers just to keep her shop. It's like people come from nowhere and it's like, oh no, we're going to raise the property taxes. We're going to raise your rent. And a lot of businesses cannot survive that. She, being a strong Black woman and an entrepreneurial mind, was able to, but most people don't have that story. And so those are the most disturbing things, but they're also what made me want to write the book and bring awareness to it.
Incredible. So this is nominally a food show. So I try to always get into food a little bit. So we've mentioned Ben's Chili Bowl, which is a staple of DC cuisine, and people who are outside of the city will have some familiarity with that. It's a great place to go and eat. And I know you did a lot of research there.
Yes.
You go to Ben's, what do you order?
Oh gosh, when I go to Ben's, I love their breakfast.
Okay.
I love their breakfast. I get the same thing. I get the half smoke, an egg platter. You shouldn't have got me talking about food.
No,
but
this is what this is
cut
about.
In half.
Yes.
I get my egg scrambled with cheese. It comes with some toast. I get a regular black coffee, cream and sugar, and I sit there and I eat it as slow as possible.
Okay.
I enjoy every bite. And I know this is probably not how you should eat a half smoke, but yes, I use a fork and a knife.
There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. See, I'm with you on that one. I know I take a lot of heat from that because I'll eat a lot of stuff with a fork and knife that you really shouldn't, stuff that you should pick up with your hands. I'm a barbecue chef. I'm supposed to be eating with my hands, but I'm not ashamed of that. So I'm with you on that one. So if you do go to Ben's Chili Bowl and you don't get the half smoke, you're making a mistake. Get the half smoke when you go in there. The one place in the corridor, it's not actually on U Street, that I've always enjoyed eating is the Florida Avenue Grill.
Yes.
That's the place I go. I've been eating, it's been there my entire life. I think it opened in 42. So I've been eating there off and on since I was a kid, and I've never not had breakfast there. Apparently they have a really good dinner. I know they got really good catfish, they got a whole bunch of other stuff, but I've eaten breakfast there my entire life and I've never had anything else. At one point in time I told myself I was gonna branch out, never did. Probably never will. So here's my last question to you. Do you cook?
So I am cooking more.
Okay.
And the pandemic and the quarantine pulled that out of me. I really was more of a to-go kind of thing. Yeah, and so I do cook a little. I won't say that I cook a lot, but I try to cook at least once a week now, which isn't bad, right?
That's not bad.
That's not too bad.
That's okay. What's your specialty? What's your go-to?
Oh, so my go-to, now my party favorite, is I always bring the buffalo chicken dip.
Okay.
And I cook it in a crock pot, and it's pretty easy. I just throw everything in there. That's how I like to just throw stuff in there and then leave it. So that's what I do. Just a little, the cans of chicken, and I season that, hot sauce, buffalo sauce, ranch, cream cheese, shredded cheddar cheese, and we're good to go.
We're gonna have to get you on some barbecue. We're gonna have to get you trying that. It's the oldest way to cook. Brianna, thanks for being on the show.
Thank you.
I'm not going to keep you too much longer, but I do want to give you the opportunity to let people know where to find you, how they can get your book, where you'll be promoting it at, and anything like that.
Yeah, so he already showed the book, but here it is again, Black Broadway, Washington, D.C. And you can buy it online. It's sold on Amazon. It's sold, you can support a local independent bookstore like Politics and Prose, or a Black-owned bookstore like Sankofa. They carry the book. Busboys and Poets also has it. Right off of 14th Street in store, and Barnes & Noble's, Books A Million, anywhere online. And then also my Instagram page is at the Black Broadway, and if you go to that page, you'll be updated with any book events, anything I do in the community, and also you'll see the link in my bio where you can buy the book there too. So thank you.
I'd like to thank Brianna for being on the show. Once again, please check out her book, Black Broadway. I'd like to thank you for watching today. I'm Roger Sherman with the District Pit. Check us out on YouTube at Pit Perspective. Check us out on Instagram at District Pit, and on Facebook, The District Pit. And once again, I'd like to thank the O Street Mansion for hosting us today. Once again, check out Black Broadway. Briana Thomas, thanks for coming on.